August 8th, 1974. President Richard Nixon is pacing the Oval Office. There aren't any walls, but it still feels like they're closing in on him. And in a sense, they are. He just met with some of his closest allies in the Senate, led by conservative stalwart Barry Goldwater, and they delivered the grim news. He has no more than 15 votes in the Senate. That's not nearly enough to stop him from becoming the first president in American history to be both impeached by the House and removed from office by the Senate. His own party is done with him. The Watergate tapes are public, the courts aren't on his side, and the math doesn't work. So Nixon does what Nixon always does. He calculates. But the number he lands on is zero. Zero options. Instead of the near certainty of impeachment and removal, Nixon resigns in a television broadcast to the nation. But what if he didn't? After all, this was a man who had shown a willingness to do whatever it takes to reach his ultimate goal of becoming and staying president. What if Nixon's math calculus changes? What if he decided to stay and go down swinging? Let's hit Control-Z. I'm Kevin Perez-Allen, and this is Control-Z, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask, what happens if they go the other way? Not luck, not fate, not what-ifs pulled out of thin air, but real people, real choices, and real alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision where we hit Control-Z, try it the other way, and see how history changes. Nixon wakes up on August 9th, 1974, and for the first time in weeks, he is not leaving. He's staying. But the phone doesn't ring. The people who would normally be calling the President of the United States in the morning, the senior staff, the cabinet secretaries, the congressional allies, most of them are either gone, indicted, or actively trying to figure out how to get away as far from this White House as possible. Nixon's inner circle at this point is basically Alexander Haig, Pat Buchanan, and really whoever hasn't updated their resume yet. Remember, this is pre-LinkedIn. The brain trust that got this man elected with 49 states in an historic landslide less than 2 years prior, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, Dean, Colson, every single one of them is either fired, resigned, cooperating with prosecutors, or under indictment. The people who knew how to run a White House are gone, and the ones who are left either couldn't leave or didn't want to, and that's not the same thing as being good at the job. And it gets worse fast. The moment Nixon announces he's staying, the next wave of resignations starts. If you're a mid-level staffer in the Nixon White House, you just watched the president's own party tell him he's done, and you watched him tell his own party to go to hell. You're not sticking around for that. You've got a career to protect, and you've got future employers who are going to check. The executive branch starts hemorrhaging people, and not just political appointees, career staff, the folks who actually make government function day to day. And the president still has a job to do while he's fighting for his political life. The economy is in bad shape. Inflation is running hot. The oil crisis from the year before is still squeezing the country. Foreign policy decisions still need to be made. The Soviet Union is watching very closely. The guy in charge of all of this is spending every waking hour on his own defense, surrounded by a shrinking circle of people who are telling him what he wants to hear because the people who used to tell him the truth are all gone. And here's the part that's genuinely unsettling. Nixon still has the full powers of the presidency, and I mean all of them. He controls the military, he controls the intelligence agencies, he has the nuclear codes. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was reportedly so concerned about Nixon's state of mind during his final days that he instructed the military to check with him before carrying out any unusual orders from the White House. The Secretary of Defense telling the chain of command to second-guess the commander-in-chief. That happened when Nixon was on his way out. If Nixon is digging in instead of packing up, does Schlesinger still issue that instruction? Does the military follow it? Or does a cornered president, who already showed during the Saturday Night Massacre that he'll fire anyone who gets in his way, fire Schlesinger before he gets the chance? Nixon fired the special prosecutor. He forced out the attorney general and the deputy attorney general in a single night to make that happen. That wasn't a hypothetical. A Nixon who's decided to fight a Senate trial has every incentive to do it again. Fire Leon Jaworski. Assert executive privilege over any new evidence. Use executive orders to change the subject, rally the base, create distractions. He's not governing anymore. He's surviving. And every single decision runs through one filter. Does this help me stay in this building? The White House at this point looks less like the West Wing and more like Hitler's bunker with a little less anti-Semitism. The lights are on. The building is technically staffed, but the person at the center of it is making decisions with fewer advisors, worse information, and higher stakes than at any point in his presidency. And historically, that's exactly when Nixon's judgment got worse, not better. The country is watching the single most consumed television event in American history up to that point. 90% of Americans tuned in for the Judiciary Committee hearings, and those were just the appetizer. A full Senate trial, Chief Justice Warren Burger presiding, witnesses being called, Nixon's defense team arguing for his survival on live television. Everything else in America stops. But the timing is brutal. The House votes to impeach around late August. That means the Senate trial starts in September. It's expected to last about 2 months. That puts the trial of the President of the United States on every television in every living room in America at the exact same time as the 1974 midterm elections. Every Republican running for anything, Congress, Senate, governor, state legislature, they all have to answer the same question every single day. Do you support the president? And honestly, there's no good answer. If you say yes, you're the guy defending the guy the whole country just heard on tape telling the CIA to block the FBI. If you say no, you're abandoning the leader of your party while he's on trial. And if you try to hedge and say, we're going to let the process play out, you sound like you're hiding. There is unfortunately no door number 4. The Republican losses in the actual midterms in 1974 were already catastrophic. They lost 43 House seats and 4 Senate seats. And that was with Nixon already gone. Remember, in our timeline, he resigned in August, Ford pardoned him in September, and the country was supposed to be moving on. But they still got destroyed. Now, imagine those elections happening while the trial is underway, while cameras are rolling. Every week brings a new witness or another Republican senator publicly breaking ranks. The losses don't just get worse here, they could be historic. This could be losses that hand Democrats a veto-proof supermajority in Congress. That is incredibly rare in American history. And that changes everything about what legislation passes, what gets vetoed, if anything, and how much power the next president actually has on day one. Nixon's approval rating was in the low to mid-20s by August of 1974. It had crashed to 24% after the Saturday Night Massacre, and it never recovered. For context, that's roughly where people estimate the absolute floor of President Trump. So this is the most loyal, immovable segment of the electorate. And Nixon had been cultivating that segment for years. The silent majority speech, the attacks on the media, the framing of every investigation as a political hit job by liberal elites who couldn't accept that he won. Does that sound familiar? A resignation, though, takes the air out of that group. Your guy quit. It's over. Go home. But a trial gives them something to rally around. A trial lets you say, they're trying to steal the presidency from 47 million voters. A trial turns Nixon from a guy who got caught into a guy who's being persecuted. And those are very 2 different stories with 2 very different afterlives. But on the other hand, 1974 was not 2016. Nixon had the rhetoric for a populist resistance movement, but he didn't have the infrastructure. There was no Fox News, there was no talk radio, there was no internet. His message was being filtered entirely through Walter Cronkite, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the big 3 broadcast networks, none of whom were sympathetic. If Nixon goes on television and says, this is a witch hunt, the next voice the viewer hears is a news anchor explaining why it isn't. So there's no echo chamber. There's no alternative information ecosystem. There's nowhere for that 24% to go and hear their version of events reflected back. The country during a Senate trial is overwhelmingly engaged, overwhelmingly watching, and overwhelmingly wanting it to be over. The Republican Party is getting shredded during an election season, and a small, fervent minority is being radicalized by what they're seeing. But they don't have the energy to put that anywhere. Yet. There are 3 ways this ends, and they all lead to a very different country. Conviction and removal is the most likely, and it's really not close. Nixon needed 34 senators to survive, and Goldwater told him he had about 15. Remember, this was after the smoking gun tape and the recording where Nixon tells the CIA to shut down the FBI's investigation. You can make a lot of arguments in a Senate trial: proportionality, executive privilege, the will of the voters. But you know what you can't argue past in 1974? Audio of your own voice. Every week of a televised trial, that tape gets played again. New witnesses add context to it, the prosecution builds on it, and unfortunately for Nixon, it doesn't fade, it compounds. And then there's the mechanical reality. A Senate trial is a jury of politicians. Every Republican senator sitting in that chamber is watching their party's candidates get destroyed on the campaign trail. The midterms are weeks away, and every poll, every fundraising report, every panicked phone call from a state party chair is telling the same story. Nixon is dragging the entire Republican Party down with him. On top of that, every week the trial drags on, the political cost of voting to acquit goes way up. The senators who might have held firm for Nixon in September are definitely looking for the exits by the end of October. The math is deteriorating every single day. Nixon's own advisors told him before he resigned that conviction was a distinct possibility. But after 2 months of a televised trial, it's a foregone conclusion. Nixon gets removed. The second outcome is unlikely, but it is worth walking through because it's the most dangerous: acquittal. So Nixon scrapes together 34 votes. Maybe fatigue sets in. Maybe the country gets tired of watching. Maybe Nixon's legal team, led by James St. Clair, manages to reframe the whole thing as political overreach. You know, the man didn't order the break-in. There's no evidence he organized it. His crime was handling the aftermath badly, and you don't remove a president for bad judgment. Maybe some Republican senators decide that the precedent of removal is scarier than the precedent of letting Nixon limp through the rest of his term. Remember, he's a lame duck president by this point. If that happens, the message to every future president is clear. You can obstruct justice on tape and keep your job as long as you hold 34 senators. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, the evidence was too clear for that to happen, I'd point out that we've watched 2 presidential impeachment trials end in acquittal in the 21st century. In those cases, people could argue the evidence was ambiguous or partisan. In Nixon's case, the evidence was a recording of the president's own voice. If 34 senators look at that and say, not enough, then the impeachment clause of the Constitution is really, for all practical purposes, a decoration. We wrote it down, it just doesn't do anything. The third outcome is the most psychologically realistic if you know anything about Richard Nixon. This is the option where he resigns mid-trial. So Nixon was, above everything else, a calculator. He counted votes, he assessed odds, and he made moves. A guy like that doesn't sit in a bunker for 2 months watching his support evaporate without running the numbers again and again. 3 weeks in, 4 weeks in, he's looking at the vote count, and it's worse than when he started. Senators who told him privately that they're going to hold the line are now hedging on camera. New witnesses are dropping new information. And so Nixon is recalculating. And the answer is the same one Goldwater gave him back in August. So he resigns. But this resignation is different from the one that happened in our timeline. When Nixon resigned in August before the House voted, it was relatively clean. He left before the system could act, and he preserved some dignity. He also maintained enough leverage to get a pardon 30 days later. A Nixon who resigns mid-Senate trial has already been impeached by the House and put on trial by the Senate. He's quitting because he's losing, and everyone knows that. There's no dignity in that, and there's no leverage. Ford has far less political cover to pardon a guy who forced the entire country through months of constitutional crisis before quitting anyways. All 3 outcomes end badly for Nixon. The question is, what do they do to the rest of us? Nixon is gone. Whether the Senate removed him or he quit mid-trial, he's out. So the first question is the pardon. In our timeline, Ford pardoned Nixon on September 8th, 1974. 1 month. Nixon resigned on August 9th. Ford pardoned him on September 8th. 30 days from president to free man. And even that was wildly unpopular. Ford's approval rating cratered. He even got dragged before a congressional subcommittee to explain himself. Most historians also believe that the pardon is the single biggest reason he lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976. And this was after a clean resignation where Nixon left voluntarily and the country was supposed to be healing. Now imagine Ford trying to pardon a president who was removed by the Senate, a president who forced the country through months of constitutional crisis, a president whose own party voted to convict him. You can't frame that as healing the nation. That looks like you're overruling the United States Senate. So Ford doesn't do it. The political math just won't allow it, which means, for the first time in American history, a former president faces criminal prosecution. Nixon goes to trial, goes to real trial. And given what was already on the tapes, and given that the grand jury had already named him as an unindicted co-conspirator before he even resigned, the odds of conviction are very high. Richard Nixon could go to prison. Former president of the United States in a cell in 1975. Now, if that happens, no one is above the law stops being something we say at press conferences and becomes something that we actually did. Every president who comes after Nixon knows that, not theoretically, but as a matter of historical record now, that the system can remove you and courts can prosecute you. Does Bill Clinton behave differently during the Lewinsky scandal? Maybe. Does the conversation around Trump's impeachments play out differently when there's a real precedent of a president being removed and prosecuted? Without question. Because removal is no longer an abstract constitutional mechanism that's never been tested. It's now happened to a guy that went to prison. The Republican Party, after all of this, is at its lowest point since the Great Depression. Nixon went down fighting and took the party with him in the midterms. And the party has a choice, and it's the same choice that it's faced at every crisis point since. Do we disown this guy completely, or do we absorb his people? If they disown Nixon, if they do the full exorcism and say this man was a criminal who disgraced the office and we're moving on, then the party rebuilds on different foundations. Ronald Reagan still exists, the conservative movement still exists, but the version in our timeline that emerges in 1980 is built on optimism, small government, and this idea of mourning in America. It's not built on grievance or the system is rigged and they're coming for you. The Nixon wing of the party, the paranoid, combative, enemies list wing, gets left behind. The trajectory from Nixon to Gingrich to the Tea Party to Trump either doesn't happen or it happens much later in a very different form. But if they absorb the Nixon loyalists, if that 20 to 25% of Republican voters come out of this believing that their president was railroaded, that grievance doesn't evaporate. It just goes underground and it's looking for a home. In our timeline, Nixon's resignation really took the air out of the balloon. He quit, it was over. His supporters were angry, but there was nothing to organize around. A resignation is a concession. But a removal is something that was done to you, and that distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Conservative media entrepreneurs would have had the most powerful origin story imaginable. They stole your president, 47 million Americans voted for Richard Nixon, and the Washington establishment took him away from you. The timeline from Nixon's removal to the creation of an alternative conservative media ecosystem could have been dramatically accelerated. Rush Limbaugh didn't actually launch his national show until 1988, and Fox News didn't go on the air until roughly 1996. The demand for those things, though, the audience waiting for someone to tell them their version of events, that audience might have been forged in a Senate chamber in 1974 instead of accumulating slowly over 2 decades. Now, the technology wasn't there yet. You can't build Fox News in 1975. Cable is just not widespread enough. There's also no internet. But the anger is there, and the sense of persecution is there. And when the technology catches up, that audience is already waiting, already organized, already telling each other the story of how they were wronged. Conservative talk radio might emerge in the late 70s instead of the late 80s. Something resembling Fox News might appear in the mid-80s instead of the mid-90s. The whole timeline of partisan media in America shifts forward. And everything that comes with it, that polarization, that fracturing, the two Americas watching two different newscasts problem, all of it arrives sooner. And then there's Nixon himself. In our timeline, Richard Nixon spent the last 20 years of his life rehabilitating his image. He wrote books about geopolitics. He consulted with presidents. He became the elder statesman of foreign policy. And by the time he died in 1994, the eulogies were very respectful. Bill Clinton even spoke at his funeral. The narrative had shifted from the president who committed crimes to the president who opened China. That rehabilitation arc is only possible because Nixon resigned before any of this happened. He left on his own terms, he took his lumps, he disappeared for a while, and then he came back as a different character in the story. A remove Nixon doesn't get that arc. You don't come back from being convicted by the United States Senate. You don't write books about geopolitics that people take seriously. You don't get calls from the White House asking for advice on Russia. You're the guy who got kicked out. You're either the cautionary tale or the martyr, but you're never the elder statesman. Which one wins, cautionary tale or martyr? Well, for 75% of the country, Nixon is the cautionary tale. The system worked, the guardrails held, even the president has to follow the rules. But for that other 25%, the ones who voted for him, the ones who believe the silent majority was real, Nixon is proof that they will come for anyone who fights for you. And that story, that narrative, whether it takes 10 years or 20 years or 40 years to fully bloom, eventually produces the politics we're living in now. So in our timeline, Nixon's resignation is remembered as the system working. The president did something wrong, he got caught, and he left. Checks and balances. The textbook version. But the actual decision to resign had nothing to do with the system working. It was Nixon doing math. He counted votes, he came up short, and he made a strategic calculation that resignation gave him better odds of avoiding prison than removal did. And he was right. He resigned on August 8th. Ford pardoned him on September 9th, 30 days from criminal president to free man. Nixon removed Nixon. The Senate never had to. And because he left before the Senate could actually do the thing the Constitution says the Senate can do, we never established the precedent that a president can be removed. We came right up to the edge, and then we let the guy decide for himself whether he wanted to jump or be pushed. And he jumped. And then we spent the next 50 years acting like that meant the system worked, when in actuality, it just meant that the system never got tested. Every presidential scandal since Watergate has played out in the shadow of that untested precedent. Clinton's impeachment, both of Trump impeachments, all of them ended in acquittal because removal had never actually happened, and it stayed theoretical. And a consequence that's never been used isn't really a consequence. We've been calling Nixon's resignation accountability for 50 years, but accountability means the system does something to you. Nixon did something to himself on his own terms, on his own timeline, and walked away a free man 30 days later. That tells you everything about how much we actually want presidents to be held accountable versus how much we just want the crisis to be over. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez-Allen. Thanks for hitting Control-Z with me.